Welcome to The Truth in This Art, your source for conversations at the intersection of arts, culture, and community. I am your host, Rob Lee. Today, I'm excited to be in conversation with my next guest. He is an award-winning choreographer, dancer, producer, educator, recognized by Dance Magazine as one of 2023's 25 to Watch. Known for his community-centric approach, he is a leader in both dance and business as the co-owner of Moore-Dunson Co. He is currently on tour for his new family show, The Remember Balloons, a dance theater production that explores memory loss, Alzheimer's, and grief through a blend of dance, music, and imaginative projections. Please welcome Dominic Moore-Dunson. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, man. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming on. It's great to have, a bearded brother. Yours is fuller than mine. So I'm a little jealous.
I'm trying. It struggles, but I'll be trying.
I'm trying to bring mine back. I was doing this weird, I'm just going to have a mustache and see if that works. And then I thought about the degree of nasty work it was. I was like, I got a bald head, mustache, no facial hair. I'm looking feral. I look wild. So reconsideration.
Yeah, appreciate it. No, I've been trying I've always think about the fact that so I had my kids in 2020 and 2021. In fact, they've never seen me without a beard. So I always see those videos on TikTok and Instagram where the dad shave it off. So it's a thing I've been thinking about, but it takes way too long for it to get back here. So I don't know.
And that no shave November and those temperatures start dropping. You're in in the Akron, right? So
I'm in Ohio, so it get cold.
So, I want to thank you for coming on, spending some time, making some time to join this podcast. And, before we get into the deeper questions of the podcast and exploring your work a bit, let's go back. How did you first get started in dance, and what inspired you to pursue choreography, movement? I've heard it described in so many different ways, but what inspired your path?
Now, I have one of those classic stories that you hear in they show the chorus line. I'm a little brother, so my sister's 2 years older than me, and our cousin was in dance classes at a dance studio. And when my mom found out, she was like, "Oh, let me put my daughter in these dance classes, right?" And here I am, the scrappy little brother who can't stop moving. I have so much energy, chaotic energy, you know what I mean? And she's basically like, "Well, if she going, he got to go too, because I need some peace in my life." So they threw some tap shoes on me when I was 2 years old. And I just had a time. I was like, I can come in here and just throw my body around for whatever amount of time, right? And no one's yelling at me or fussing at me or anything. So that's really how it started. And also my sister, I kind of just followed her around during our childhood. Anything she did, I wanted to do too. So I really stuck with it because she did, mostly. And then we auditioned for a performing arts middle school in Akron called Miller South. And I was there from 4th grade through 8th grade, and I got to dance every day. And that's when I started taking ballet. I took modern dance for the first time. It was super weird because you didn't have socks or shoes on, and you were like a unitard. It was super strange, right? Yeah. Took jazz, took tap, and still had my outside dance studio. And then I went to high school, and I went to a performing arts high school where I was taking dance class again all the way through 12th grade and still doing, the corner dance studio thing where I was doing dance competitions. But when I went to high school, at a school called Firestone High School, their dance department was very different than how I think a lot of dance departments is for high schools. Usually it's this is kind of a conservatory where we're trying to make you better dancers. Yeah. My high school was introducing the art of choreography to 14-year-olds.
Oh, wow.
So the Intimate Act of Choreography is an old school choreography book that everybody has. And you usually get that when you go to your first choreography class in college when you're a sophomore or junior in college. And I had it when I was a freshman in high school. So they were walking us through this book over the course of 4 years. And so your sophomore year, you had to choreograph a solo for yourself and perform it in front of the whole school. Your junior year, you had to choreograph a piece with a partner. Your senior year, you had to choreograph a piece by yourself on other dancers in the class that you were in high school. So I was introduced to this idea of making movement when I was 14. Yeah. So it became kind of a normal part of my dance life, right? The idea of making choreography didn't feel separate from dancing. Yeah. I'd be at school all day, learning how to make choreography, get out of school at 3:30, go to the dance studio at 4:30, and then go dance for the rest of the night, right?
Yeah.
In my corner dance studio situation. So it was just kind of like a part of everything.
Yeah.
And I think the first time I realized, like, oh, I might be onto something. I had to create my solo when I was a sophomore. And I decided to do a tap piece because at the time I wanted to be a tap dancer really bad. And Hurricane Katrina had just happened that school year.
Oh, wow.
And I decided I wanted to make this tap dance because I was hearing the news. I was hearing about all these people down in the New Orleans area who didn't feel like they were being heard by the government. And, this is me at, 15, 16 years old or whatever. And so I decided to make this tap piece where at the beginning of the piece, all the theater lights are dark, the stage lights are dark, and I started tapping really, really softly. So all you could hear is taps, but you couldn't see anything. And about 90 seconds in, the lights would come up, but I would look like a silhouette. And that happened for another like 90 seconds. And as the lights came on more, the taps got louder and more like voracious.
Nice.
And then it retrograded itself back down. So by the end, it was dark again. You heard these like taps. And I called the piece Hear Me Out. And I did this piece, and I got like all of this like kids coming up to me, high school kids coming up to me, talking about how great the piece was. Even girls being like, "Was that about Hurricane Katrina?" And they could just tell, right? It's just abstract movement, abstract art. And they could tell, and I was like, "I think I might be all right at this.
Yeah.
I think I might have something here." So that kind of started the bug of like, "Oh, I can do this thing for real." So then when I got much older, went through dance companies. I played soccer, went to a Division I soccer school for a hot second, but decided to go into dance fully. That's what I wanted to do in my life. I was always had the goal of I'm going to dance in a company. I'm going to be a professional dancer and learn how to do that. But my goal is to make work because I got something I want to say in the world.
And that's a good segue into this next question, but I definitely want to comment on it because I didn't notice that thing. And I like when, having folks do their introduction and just letting them cook because you get that extra detail. Soccer and dance, there's some overlap there. You were on a fleet foot. You're like, oh, I got this. It's like, oh, to the side. And let me hit this spin real quick.
Oh, yeah.
And they're like, can we just slide tackle this dude? Come on.
Right? Can we just, oh, yeah. Well, and it didn't help, right? Like I was in high school, and by my junior year in high school, I was 6'1", 175, right? And I was a center back.
Oh, wow.
So like I could jump real high because I also spent all the time dancing, right? Like I was really flexible, really agile, and it really, really helped, right? I think it's a lot of the reasons I got to the University of Akron, which at the time was the number 3 school in the country at college soccer.
Yeah.
But I think dance is a lot of the reason I got into that space because I just understood how to use my body amongst space, right? Like if you look at soccer, to go on with my nerdy soccer tangent, if you watch soccer, it's just choreography.
Mm-hmm.
Like it really just is moving bodies in space and in time. And sometimes there's music. That's choreography.
And thank you for that because I think of wrestling in the same way. And one other thing I'll throw out there because I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it. You touched on high school being a thing, and it's that's one of those periods where I think it's not appreciated as much as it should be that sometimes for the things that we're doing now, in our 30s and so on, that there's some roots right there. It's for whatever reason. So like, podcasting, I remember having a microphone, little handy microphone at 14, and I was a troll. So that's another piece of it. I was in one of those really stringent schools, and it was just like, yo, your grades are not good. You're gone. Kind of like, if you got a C, it's a wrap. Mm-hmm. And I would go around with the mic and I was like, let me talk to everyone who's not going to be here next semester. I was one of those guys.
That's hilarious.
And I would do it in the third person because I was a big fan of The Rock. So I was on one. I will not unearth those tapes, but that is sort of the earliest iteration of me recording sound and kind of doing interviews and so on with folks. And having that interest now, nearly 26 years ago, it's wild.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I find in my conversations that artists, and I'm using this as broadly, and I don't like the term creatives because that feels weird because it's like, it's deprecated, a little bit, but artists, their work often goes beyond the surface. Like, someone were to just use one word, it's like, oh, dancer. And it's like, more than that. Or for me, it's like, oh, podcaster. And some people struggle with the term artist, right?
Mhm.
And I think painters, for sake of argument, when you hear about, an artist, painters are more than just a painter. They're more than what they're doing on a canvas or on a wall for a mural. For instance, there's storytelling in their work. Right. And I think your work is no different, in terms of the research I've been doing, and even some of the stuff you were touching on specifically with the solo piece, the Katrina piece. Could you tell me about some of the aspects of storytelling and community engagement that go into your work? Because it's, as you described that, I was almost taken back. I wasn't there, but, take it back to what, 2005.
Mhm.
So, talk a bit about that sort of intersection of storytelling being baked in your work and driving your work, and sort of the community engagement aspects of it as well.
You know, I think I realized I just love stories at such a young age. Like I was just always attracted. I don't know if it's a '90s kid, the Disney thing. I don't know what it is, but I was just always really attracted to stories and writing stories growing up.
Yeah.
And it really hit me kind of cognitively about storytelling in 2017. I was listening to this podcast called "You Are a Storyteller."
Yeah.
And a guy named Brian McDonald, he's someone that like Disney and all these other folks bring in as a story consultant. And he's kind of like teaching about storytelling. So I was listening to it, trying to get better at storytelling. And he tells this story, and he's talking about how storytelling is something that's been innate in humans since the beginning. And how we've always told stories as survival information for the next generation. And he always used the idea of the tortoise and the hare. You tell the tortoise and the hare to young kids, and the moral of the story is slow and steady wins the race. And so when you get older and you're in your 30s and you're freaking out about life and you're moving 1,000 miles per hour,
Right.
the thing you should remember is slow and steady wins the race. And when he said this, there was something that I remembered about growing up. So I grew up in a house with my great grandma, my grandma, my mom, and my older sister.
Oh, wow.
So I had that many generations of women in the house, and I was the baby in the house.
Yeah.
So storytelling, the amount of stories I always heard in my life, and I could never always understand why I was being told things in story form. And it was always, the ending was like, and that's why you need to clean your room when I tell you to, right? Like the ending was always just like, and this is why you should always do what I tell you to do, because they were trying to teach me about life through the act of storytelling, but I didn't really understand that.
Yeah.
And so when I heard this podcast, I was like, oh my God, that's been my whole life. My whole life has been that. So I started the act of being like, okay, what is a thing in dance I could do with storytelling in a way that no one else is doing it, right? So I've committed myself to storytelling in this way that is abstract in nature and literal in nature, and trying to find the married place, right? Where like you can follow the arc of story or storyness. Sometimes it's a narrative show. Sometimes it's just a sense of journey of the characters. But you always walk away being like, that's the thing I was supposed to take away from this. And it's a little weird because as a contemporary artist, we usually have this open, like, hey, you take whatever you want. And there's still elements of that in different sections, but I'm usually saying something very, very specific about a work, right? And I just find that it resonates with people differently. I live in Northeast Ohio. I don't live in one of the meccas of dance,
Right.
right? Like, love Cleveland, but you know the way people talk about Cleveland, Ohio. Imagine being their younger brother. Right.
Right.
The city I'm from. And so when you think about dance of all art forms in Akron, Ohio, the people in your audience aren't dance aficionados, right?
Sure.
Like I always say that like the thing that I realized about dance, I think that made me a better dance artist is when I realized, oh, people don't care about this art form.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And that made me have to think differently about how to present it. Right. I couldn't have this idea that like, well, people innately care about what I'm saying in this art form, so I can kind of do what I want to. That ain't it, homie. They really, really don't care. Right. Like if you try to have a show on a Sunday when the Browns are playing, no one's coming. And the Browns suck. You know what I'm saying? But like the
Right.
priorities of life when it comes to art. So I realized very quickly, because storytelling is innate to humans,
Yeah.
people attach themselves to story even when dance makes them feel uncomfortable. So I've been able to get people to show up into the audiences because when I'm on a podcast talking about a show I'm doing, or I'm in a news outlet talking about a show, I can talk about the story that they're coming to see, and they're interested in that topic or that story, and then we do it in dance form, and then people go, oh, I guess I kind of like dance actually, and I didn't know that.
Right.
And it's just because you put it in a sense of story. So there's that piece. And then the community engagement part, I think that really hit me in the first kind of big piece I ever made. So I made the show called The Black Card Project. And in around 2015, like all of a sudden our nation was talking a lot about police brutality. Black kids were getting shot all over our country. And it was like becoming national news all the time. And I was traveling the country in a dance company. And one night I was just like, yo, like, I want to do something. And I remember that at the same time when I was growing up, being this kid who danced and played soccer and this coming from this all black community,
Yeah.
I was not seen as like one of the black kids, right? Like I was an Oreo, I was a white boy because I wanted to do all the stuff that black kids didn't do. So when I grew up and I realized that some of those same kids who kind of had this idea that if you didn't do black a certain way, you weren't black enough.
Yeah.
The same kids who found themselves in trouble in prison because they like their scope of what they could be was really, really small. And then here I am traveling the country as this dancer, like wearing a unitard on stage and doing my thing all the time, right? And so I decided I wanted to do something. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I could make dances. So I made the show called The Black Card Project that's about this little boy named Artie. And his mom was very concerned about his lack of awareness of his cultural identity. So she sent him to this urban downtown school called Booker T. Malcolm Luther Parks Academy of Absolute Blackness.
That's good.
And in a single school day, he had to pass all these classes, like how to dance on beat, Thuggin' 101, and all these things in order to earn his black card.
Right.
So when I kind of came up with that idea, I was like, it would be interesting if I could get residencies and work with kids to see what they thought about this subject or this topic, right? So I like do dance classes and do movement workshops, and we just talk about race and identity. Like, how did they feel about themselves? Did they think they could be anything they wanted to? So I did that with middle school, in a high school. And then my brother worked for Goodyear Rubber and Tire Company, and they had an affinity group called the Black Goodyear Network. And so I got into this Fortune 500 company and did the same thing with these suits, right? Talking about self-implicit bias. What does it mean to be black in corporate spaces? Do you feel black because you work in corporate space? So we were taking all the things these people were saying and implementing that into the choreography.
Wow.
And then I would go back and show these people the choreography before we like did the show and get their opinions. Like, hey, do you like this part? What should be different? They'd be like, well, we talked about this, so I wonder if he should do this. And these aren't dance people, right?
Right.
But I would frame it in such a way where they could watch it and be like, oh, you should change that because this is the thing we talked about. And I think that would look more like what we talked about. So I basically did that over the course of like 9 months, and I put this show on stage. And then everybody who came to the show were all these people who were involved in the making of it, right? So it wasn't just me as the choreographer and the one other dancer in it. There was 50 people in the audience who were also choreographers. So this idea, I've kind of just like continued to build on that. Like, what does it look like to involve people in the creative process of making a show? Learning other people's stories, honoring people's stories, and not being the sole person, kind of like the genius artist who decides, I'm the one who knows everything, I'm gonna make the thing, everybody should be down with it. But like, what does it mean to be almost like a curator of stories and storyness and putting into something that feels right for all of us and then presenting what we came up with? So that's kind of more how I look at my work than like the sole, genius choreographer who just makes stuff and everybody should be down with it.
That's really, really good. I like the way that you explained that, because I think, when I'm having these conversations, this is how I relate, right? And when I'm having these conversations and folks say, oh, you're a storyteller, I was like, yeah, sure. But I was like, in this scope, I'm helping to facilitate someone sharing their story. I'm a facilitator of anything. I am a point guard.
Right.
I'm a very slow, not agile point guard. It's like, I'm going to back you down from half court.
Right.
Ball guy. I'm gonna back you down from half court. Then it's like pocket pass, but really it's, in terms of going deeper than that, it's in the curation. It's in who I'm talking to, how I'm talking to them. And that's sort of the thing. And I've seen so many sort of baseless, sort of mid sons, daughters, if you will. It's a few copies that are floating out there, and I don't think they're getting it. They look at it on the surface level of, oh, you just talk to people.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just that. Like, I make it a point to send over the questions beforehand, and folks kind of get an idea if this is the direction that I'm trying to go at, and they're able to see like, oh, he actually takes this serious. He didn't ask me, so dance, right? That's a thing. It's like, no, what's baked into it.
Right. Right. Yeah. And that's the thing. Like, everyone has a story.
Mhm.
Every single person you know on this earth has a story, and that's the brilliance of it. So you don't have to feel like you're playing God and you're building stories out of nothing, right? Nothing's new under the sun.
Right.
So my role is just to be the editor in the room, use my skills as a choreographer to edit how everything is put together, but kind of crowdsourcing the stories from the community so they can just be told in the clearest way possible.
Yeah. So I saw this one thing that came up, urban Midwest storytelling. Talk about that. Give us that quick sort of, what that is before I move into this next one.
Yeah, so I'm from Akron, Ohio, which is a Rust Belt city, right? And if anybody knows anything about the Midwest, Rust Belt cities, we had, the companies that kind of boomed us in the 20th century, they all left, and we kind of look like these dilapidated cities in the Midwest, right? And then at the same time, I'm in Northeast Ohio, where the Rockefellers are originally from, and because they're from Cleveland.
Yeah.
And so what they did is they built something called the Emerald Necklace through Northeast Ohio. So it starts up kind of near Cleveland, comes all the way through Akron, and goes back up to the other side of Cleveland. So there's this really interesting environmental dichotomy I grew up in of like buildings that look the worst
Right.
in the most beautiful greenery. Like if you come to Akron, one of the first things you'll say, especially in the spring, is, I didn't think there'd be so much greenery here.
Yeah.
And it's just the most interesting thing to see all these factories that used to have life in them be lifeless next to literally some of the most, I live like 3 miles away from a national park, right? And it's like that, growing up in that is such an interesting thing. So I kind of took that environmental idea and started using it in choreography. So in my movement, like, what does it look like for there to be like a sense of hopelessness about my storytelling in the movement, but also the sense of beauty and the sense of life. So there's always this kind of juxtaposition of I'm reaching this way, but I'm pulling my torso back this way. So it's always inside the movement, and the storytelling also has that sensibility. So in the show that I'm doing now, the Remember Balloons, you're talking about Alzheimer's, right? Something that can be so hopeless. But then I'm asking, well, where's the hope inside of this, though? So you feel that tension constantly when you're watching my work.
And thank you. And you kind of queued it up a little bit there. Let's talk about the Remember Balloons. Award-winning children's book that's that you've adapted, and there's themes of memory loss, aging, intergenerational relationships. What was that draw to that sort of subject matter? Because I did an interview in this podcast that I had the opportunity to teach this past summer, and I was talking about being vulnerable in the class and folks sharing their stories and so on, right? And I referenced an interview that I did with it was a playwright and Tanya Everett, and we talked about sort of grief and and having that conversation that's baked into this TED talk she did, called The Grief Dance. And definitely I'll send you the link, but it's one of those things. And it was sort of an interview that I wasn't expecting to have a emotional reaction to. And in the podcast, that was the thing. So, sort of that notion of we all get older and we all have stories, right? We're all getting older. And that notion of your story and maybe forgetting pieces of your story. I don't want to be diving in too deep, but I'm going to give that up to you. But it's just something that I think is a shared thing. But what drew you initially to the story? Because I read about you were also in like a library or a bookstore. So let's talk about that.
Yeah. So I didn't plan this. So I have two, well, they're not toddlers anymore, but at the time they were 2 and 1 years old. And we used to go, me and my wife used to take them to the local library here where we live every week just to go get more books, come back, read them, go get books the next week. And one week we had been to the play section for like 90 minutes, and I was like kind of getting bored. I was like, all right, we got to go home. I'm sick of being here. So I go to the bookshelf, and I'm like just looking through books, and I come across this one shelf that says children's books about difficult topics. And if you know me, difficult topics, chef's kiss. That's where I'm at. And so I started like flipping through these books. I'm like, oh, this is super cool. And I pull out this white book that's grayscale and has all these colorful balloons on it. And skeptically, I looked at it like, dog, it's balloons. How hard could this be? So I opened it up, and I read this story about this little boy named James who has all these memories that are inside his balloons that he holds, which was a really cool concept. And I was like, oh, super dope. So I keep flipping, and he loves his grandpa. Him and grandpa always tell each other stories. His grandpa has all these balloons. And as you keep going, I'm just reading this story, and he's talking about his favorite dog, and this one time when he was young, and there was this cow and all this cool stuff. And I'm like, oh, this is really cute. And then this page comes and it goes, but Grandpa's been having trouble with his balloons lately.
Oof. Oof.
And I like all of a sudden, like my hand's like turning the pages slower now than it was before. And you see that, him and Grandpa have this shared memory that's silver where they went fishing one time.
Yeah.
And as the story goes, Grandpa starts losing more and more balloons. And all of a sudden, James is like running across the page trying to capture his balloons to bring them back to him, but he can't. And of course, the last balloon he loses is the silver balloon. So he forgets who James is. And by this point, the tears are starting to run down his face. And so you see this little boy trying to figure out, like, how do you deal with being forgotten by somebody you love? And so he's like trying to figure out, and his parents tell him, look up. And so he does. And there's more balloons than there was at the beginning of the book that he has. And he comes to realize, because Grandpa told me all his stories, I'm now the holder of his balloons.
Wow.
And so the very last page, my favorite point is he climbs up into Grandpa's lap. So he's sitting in Grandpa's lap, telling Grandpa about his new balloons, telling him his own stories.
Wow.
I am crying. Rob, I am losing it in this children's section of the library. So I handed it to my wife. I'm like, you have to read this right now. And I'm like looking over her shoulder as she's reading it to see if she's crying too. And she ends up crying. So we pack up the kids, we go home. We start having this long discussion throughout the afternoon and evening about Alzheimer's and dementia.
Yeah.
And she goes, I remember the day my grandma forgot me and never remembered who I was anymore. In full context, we're 34 and 33. We've been together since we were 17 and 18 years old. I never heard that story before.
Right.
And I was like, what? And I was asking all these questions. And so later that night, because I had toddlers and I wasn't sleeping at the time, it was like 2 a.m. And I was like, I wonder if I can find the author's website. So I just looked up her website, JessieOliveros.com. And then I just go to type to her like, hey, this story's amazing. This is what it did for my family. And at the very end, I was like, would you ever consider letting me turn this into a theater show? Send. Never thought anyone would get back to me. Very next day, I get an email from an agent. Hey, I got like 30 minutes today at 3 o'clock to hear your ideas. Would love to hear it. And I'm like, sick. What ideas? I had no ideas. So, I read the book, felt like 100 times. I came up with these ideas, talked about like, I'm going to get this music, original music by Theron Brown, jazz score, this whole thing. And I'm just making things up. And I'm like telling the story. And long story short, I did a pitch with them, did a pitch with the illustrator the next week, and 5 months later, we owned the North American rights to the story all the way through 2026. So we're the only ones who can make the story in North America. And what attracted me to it as someone who doesn't personally have Alzheimer's in their family lineage was the generational storytelling. Because it goes back to that thing I was saying earlier about my life. Yeah. My great-grandma, my grandma, my mom, my older sister, spending time telling me stories about how to survive in this world. And you had Grandpa telling James all these stories, and now it gets flipped. Now James is telling Grandpa all these stories. So that's the thing that just pulled at me. And I was like, I just had this feeling, there's something about this story. There's something there. And I've never adapted a thing from a book before. This is the first time ever. But I was just like, there's something too important about this. I'm just going to go on faith, go on a limb, and see what I can figure out. And here we are.
Wow. I mean, in hearing that piece, I was definitely curious about it, of, sort of the the collaboration, you mentioned Theron Brown. So talk a little bit about that collaboration there and sort of, sort of the shaping, like, as you were saying a moment ago, haven't done an adaptation in that way, before. So what was that like? And maybe taking something from literally a children's book, and it's like, this is now going to be a theater show.
Yeah. Well, first, I think it's really important to mention like Theron and I, both in our mid to late 30s. He has three kids under six. I have two kids under four. So we're kind of sort of in the same place in life. So I think that's helpful. We're both dads. We're both artists. So like we're just trying to figure this thing out. And he's from Akron as well. So we've known each other for years, and we decided we always wanted to do something together. And I was like, this is the thing. So when we got into the studio with the dancers, I decided up front, we're going to build this entire show through improvisation. The entire thing.
Yeah.
So he was on the piano in the dance studio. I had the dancers, and we do all these exercises. So an exercise would be like, okay, start on this side of the room, dancer A. I want you to act as if you're entering a memory, experience that memory, and then exit the memory on the other side of the room. And then they would just start improvising that, and he would improvise with them. So we did all of these experimental improvisational based exercises to just first figure out what is the relationship between dance and music in this world we're creating.
Right.
And then also what I like to do is I often have like a whiteboard in the studio too with markers. And so as we're talking about stuff and we're experiencing things in the studio today, we'll write questions on the board. So one of the first questions we came up with was, what is the weight of memory?
Mm.
So basically, do some memories weigh more than others? Are some memories more important than others, or are they same? And that came just from like the physical weight dancers were feeling when they're doing some improvised exercises, and the way Theron was playing some weighty notes versus other ones. So those are kind of questions that were popping up. And Rob, we probably came up with literally 100 questions. Just like, what does it feel like to lose your memory? What does it feel like to lose your memory when you know you're losing it? Because that's different.
Yeah.
It seems like you're losing your memory and you don't know what's happening, right? And so all that investigation brought up all the things we needed to know about these characters before we all started actually working on like scene one.
Yeah.
And we probably did that for 3 months of improvising. And like when we were in the studio, these were long days, so it'd be like 5 hours of improvising. So by hour 5, you're running out of stuff to make up, right?
Right.
But like hour 5 is where the good stuff comes in.
Mm-hmm.
Because you've like gotten rid of all the things you know how to do, and all of your like kind of like the things you said in your brain, like, oh, I'm going to improvise. I know I'm good at these things. You start digging in real deep. So all that improvising also created this marriage between the music and the dance, because everything from then on was built together. As we continue starting to actually make the show, Theron played the entire score of the entire show on the piano from memory, because he just watched the dancers and just play. Right. So as dancers were making adjustments in real time, he was making adjustments in real time and remembering them, and then going and sitting down and writing what he remembered. Or we like video a lot of stuff so we could capture it on video. So it was all about the act of being in improvisation, making ideas and choices on the fly, recording those things. So then all the recordings, all the questions, all that stuff basically gets put into like a pot of soup. Right. And then you can decide like, okay, we need a little bit more of this than I thought. We actually need to take out some of this than I thought. And then you end up with this soup that you actually really want, because you're like, okay, we authentically came to the studio in this space with making, as opposed to being like, let me write down the script of exactly every movement that's going to happen and then do it like that. So it was really this true, authentic collaboration, and frankly, a lot of storytelling amongst each other. I learned a lot about those dancers I didn't know. I learned a lot about Theron I didn't know. They learned a lot about me. Just because when you end up working on a subject this difficult, you end up having real conversations about your life. And that influences the literal muscle fabrics the dancers use in their body. And that's what I love in it.
That sounds like amazing. That sounds like something that is a huge, like, you look at the, sort of before, and you sort of the after. It's like, how am I changed as a artist after this experience? And, this podcast was born in an improv space and in the Baltimore Improv Group Theater. And, I'm not an improv person, but I respect it, I acknowledge it. And I did another podcast for about 10 years. And I'd have a few things, like a few notes that I'm like, okay, I want to cover this, but we're riffing. We're going off the top of the dome, in this pod. And, sort of those skills are baked in. And another thing that comes to mind, you're describing sort of maybe from those 5 hours and getting to that back end, right? That's almost in my head, and I see you get the Nike joint on, so I feel like you've lifted a weight in your days. It's almost like when you get to like, all right, I'm at my top set. What do we
Yeah,
got? What do we have here? And you get to see, are you actually strong or you been BSing?
that's it. That's
Yeah.
it. Yeah, because when you get to that point in the creative process, you actually stop relying on all the years of training.
Hmm.
You start relying on is the authentic conversation you've been having in the room all day.
Yeah.
What you start relying on is the way your body's falling into positions. What Darren starts relying on is the tiny melodies are starting to show up that he would usually ignore. Because it's like, I gotta go get something because I've been doing this all day. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, this is it. That 5 second melody, that's the beginning of the entire section of Grandpa Remembers, right? That one movement, oh my gosh, that is the motif that's going to show us that Grandpa is aging throughout the entire show. But it was because we got to 4 hours and 47 minutes of improvising that you get this movement that feels like he's listening to something and then memories come out of his ears,
Yeah.
right? Like that's how you get there. And we really utilize that process as a way to find this entire show.
It's fantastic. So I got like one more real question. It's a multi-part question, and then I got some rapid fire questions. So, my understanding is as we're recording is you guys just kicked off, just like launched one of the first dates in Virginia, what have you, and this is part of a multi-city tour. So, I know we're fresh in, but what's that been like seeing from sort of that period in which you're describing, sort of the building up, the pre-production, the, improvisation of it all, and building what this adaptation is going to be like to sort of being in the very beginning of this multi-city tour, and also, what were some of those considerations in sort of which cities to go to, where to go at during this tour? So talk a bit about that.
Yeah. So a lot of the cities that we're going to, they actually helped in the pre-production of the show. They learned about what I wanted to do, the process I wanted to take, and they said, we want to be a part of this somehow. So whether it was just bringing me to come to the community, do some residency stuff, talk, I did a lot of classes with senior citizens and students, or bringing the entire company and us going and working on the actual show in the theater. They're letting us have the theater for free. So we can do that, paying us to be there, which is incredible. This doesn't happen for most artists in this way. So we were able to work on the show. And even in those early days, one of the things that always like got me, because I've always been really intentional about every time we're about to leave a city that's brought us in to work on the show, we're going to do a showing of some kind, even if it's 4 minutes. 4 minutes to the whole thing. I don't care what it is. We need to show something. And it's you get these stories out of people, man. Like this show pulls stories out of people that you're like, you literally would have never told me that. I could have asked you for that specific story 1,000 times. You never told me that. But it's because like they're watching what we're building in front of them in such like a visceral way. I'll never forget, we were in Sheridan, Wyoming, which is one of the stops that we're doing in November. And I was in this residency with these kind of the senior citizen class, and we were working on this idea of like feeling comfortable being storytellers with our bodies. And one of these women, probably 70 years old, said, this class has made me realize I'm really uncomfortable being a storyteller, and it's because I thought no one in my family ever wanted to hear my stories. And I said, well, say more. And she goes, I'm so used to being the person taking care of everybody. I've convinced myself that no one cares about the things I have to say or what I care about and want to share in this world. And I was like, well, do you know that for sure? And she's like, no, I've assumed this entire time. And I was like, well, maybe you might be right, but also they might be waiting on for you to say something. And she goes, well, I don't care if they are or not. They're about to start hearing the stories now, which is awesome. But even in that, like that conversation was the reason I created this section in the show that doesn't exist in the book. There's a section in the show called Invisible Mom, where we make the mom character a bigger character in the show, and she does this whole solo about her feelings of being the sandwich generation between James and her grandpa, being the caregiver of both, but her feeling that no one takes care of her. And it's like the emotionally the most difficult section in the show. But like those type of stories just keep coming out. We were in Des Moines, Iowa, and had someone working with us, a videographer who was kind of just talking to us about what we were doing, and he interviewed me in there. And at the end of it, this very large, like 6'5" man was bawling, talking to us about his mom, who has Alzheimer's. And he was saying that him and his brother have been fighting for a while now about whether to tell her she has it or not. And he decided after watching the show over the last couple of days, he's going to call his brother after he leaves, and he's going to say, we're telling her. And now I'm not saying there's a right or wrong answer to that, but it's the fact that like this person took action as a result of seeing this work, right? And that's all we can really ask for at the end of the day is like that people don't feel like they're in this weird limbo with this conversation that's so difficult. What do I do with my grandparents? Do I talk to them? Do I not talk to them? It's about allowing them to have agency to make a decision. And the thing I've told the dancers 100 times is if we go through all this stuff and it's one person who decides I'm going to stop ignoring this and I'm going to push forward in some way, shape, or form with my family. We're going to talk about what's going on. We're going to make sure grandma has what she needs, whether that means us every day or us not at all, but we're going to do something. So we're taking care of our people, and we're taking care of the stories that they hold. We've won. That's all we got to do. And so, yeah, the stories are amazing. Even like from the show, one of the things that I think is really taking me back is how young people in the audience is sitting next to their parents. And after the show, we always do like a 15-minute Q&A. And these young people, they raise their hand up strong and ask these very, very poignant questions, right? Why was mom so upset? Well, why do you think? Well, it seemed like she was frustrated because she can't help grandpa. And they're sitting next to their parent, and the parent's like, what? Right? Like, because as adults, we don't think kids understand what's happening in the world around them. And they do a lot more than we think, right? Because they're willing to just experience life and let kind of their interpretation come to them about life. Whereas adults are always trying to intellectualize and dissect everything without it touching us in our heart, right? So like watching kids do that next to their parents, it's just like it warms my heart because I'm like, they're about to go have a real conversation in the car when they leave. That's what we want. We want people to leave and have actual conversations they would never have otherwise. And then maybe hopefully get to the point where they understand that, you know, I need to start sharing my stories with my kids, or I need to get more of the stories out of my parents and make sure I collect them somehow so people's stories live on and on and on.
Yeah. You know, I'll share this one thing, you know, that relates to it, but in sort of my lane that, so I remember growing up, this is so ridiculous and off center, but I remember growing up and my dad, he'll be 70 this year. And, you know, just you hear certain stories, you hear like the same stories. And then it's like, all right, you're not really sharing that story or kind of less details with this one. And I remember, and that's one of my fears too. Also, just being a person that's kind of I guess a heady intellectual person and kind of having those lapses and those slips myself at times. You know, that's a thing of, you know, anxiety, right? And I remember I had this opportunity. My dad's like, you know, ex-Marine and all of that stuff. So we're in this studio, in my studio, and I do a movie review podcast that I haven't touched on in a while, but I had him come on and do a movie review with me. And it was an old Jean-Claude Van Damme movie.
Wow.
It was double impact, double the Van Dammage. And we're sitting there. He was so shy and talking about it. I was like, all right. But then just him, he was lit up in that he remembered us being kids watching this movie with him. And that being part of like, you know, me and my brother being part of our childhood and watching these, going to Blockbusters every Friday night.
That's right.
Let me get these VHS joints. What we got? Oh, Steven Seagal got a new one? Yeah, I'm gonna get that.
Yeah, man.
And then being able to maybe revisit that. And then the kicker of it is having it as a recording. So it's just like, yeah, you know, he didn't talk much during the thing, you know, but it is one of those things of him listening to me recall sort of what my experience was, you know, it kind of experiencing that with him and just like, oh, okay, cool. Yeah, you did enjoy that. You did appreciate that. it was, I don't know, it was just a really cool thing. And it comes from just doing a podcast and capturing the story. That was the other thing about it. Like, there's a recording of this conversation about this movie that came out 30 years ago. You know? Yeah.
And it's, we underestimate the power of, I think even like this idea of artists being storytellers. Like storytelling has become like such a buzzword. Like storytelling, it's this thing that only a select few of us actually know how to do.
Right.
When it's like literally every one of us does it every day.
Yeah.
Right? Like some of us frame it in a different way, which is why like we get paid to do it, but we all do it. But we underestimate the importance of everyday storytelling. Right? Oh, there they go talking about that story again. Right? But so I'll tell you one that I throughout this process, because I decided like I need to hear from my grandma more, right? My grandma is a younger grandma. When I was born, she was 46 years old. I grew up with my grandma, right? So she's, 81 or 82 now. And so I was asking her these questions. She's from Kent, Ohio, and she was like one of 3 black families in Kent, right, in the mid 20th century. And she was born in 42. And she's telling me the story about like, yeah, we used to go to church. She's like, and we used to throw peanuts at like all the people, on the ground. And I was like, well, Grandma, how come y'all always sat up at top? She was like, well, we weren't allowed to go on the bottom. I was like, because of segregation? What? Like, but it was just like, but to her, it's just this story about how we were kids and we used to throw peanuts at all the white people on the ground, right? And it was like, in the context of history, you're like, what are you talking about? But she has never ever told me a story about living through segregation.
Right.
Plainly. It just comes out this way. And then she tells me the story where she's 18 or 19. She's working at this corner store. And she said, like, I was working at the corner store and all of a sudden, all these people came down the street. They were busting in the windows of the corner store, all this stuff. I ran upstairs. I locked the door. I like hid up there all night. And she was like, Kent was like on fire. Da 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 da. I was like, well, Grandma, when was this around? Like, something like the 1960s. Da da da. I was like, you mean when Martin Luther King died?
Right.
But she would have never said, I remember the time Martin Luther King died and there was a riot in Kent. It just comes out in this kind of free flowing like way. And you're just like, your life has been time-stamped by such important parts of our history, especially as Black people. Yeah. You don't view it that way. And if I don't hear your stories and then compare it to the time, I'm not going to know that balloon.
Right.
And I'm not going to be able to pass that balloon to my children who, I'm one generation away from segregation, right? My kids are, 2 or whatever it is. But I'm able to take this balloon and go, Gran,
yeah,
she grew up like this. And it's the importance of that so that like things like American history just don't sound like things in a history book. But they have people that they love and they loved growing up when they were kids who were a part of history. Yeah. And that part's really important to me. Like, the book's about Alzheimer's. It's about dementia. It's about generational storytelling. But there's a much bigger meta conversation about the telling of history through people. Right. And story. And that's the thing that I think I'm so passionate about is get people's stories, get their balloons, and then figure out what was going in the world at the same time. Because that's how we're going to tell the story of our country and the story of our people. And we have to stay connected to that. We can't let it go. And it's really hard during an age of technology where it feels like everything's on a screen. But the importance of hearing people's stories and hearing them over and over and over again so much that you can tell it correctly, yeah, super important. And that's why, like, as the show's developed, like, I keep getting more passionate about, we got to figure out ways to do this. We got to figure out ways to tell our story of the Remember Balloons to help people get inspired to capture other people's stories.
It's really, really, really important. And, that's one of the intents in doing this, as I, shared, earlier that, I recently released my 800th episode, and it's one of those things where getting the feedback from folks of like, this is a living archive. This is sort of this moment in time of this place, these people, and what they're doing. And sort of some of my intentions, really embracing that are, all right, let's go back into earlier in that archive and see where people are at now and kind of do that sort of follow up, where you at in your work now. And almost like, no one's an animal. I'll just say that, but it's almost like you tag an animal. It's like, all right, where did Wombat?
Yeah.
but the capturing those stories is so important. And it's the last thing I'll say before I move into these rapid fire questions is I think it's really important to be able to capture those stories and, as you were saying, having people do them, because often, you know, we have these conversations where it's in the best interest of certain folks to maybe glaze over parts of history and not talk about parts of history. And I have a pretty good memory, and and like we get weird when it's stuff from like 5 years ago.
Oh yeah,
I was like, when wasn't this person trash? Did
right, right.
I'm like, oh, they're back. Oh, okay, cool. We forgot all about that. All right, okay, cool, cool. And and because I'm a data analyst in my day job, when there's a number attached, woo. So it's that for me, and I see that sort of stuff happening. And as we have these grandparents, these parents, and so on, as they're getting maybe further away from that timestamp moment, it's important to really get that story, get that memory, capture that balloon, if you will, and hold on to it, because it's in someone else's best interest not to put history in books, not to have history documented, because I want it warts and all. I want the full thing, so I know what's good.
Yeah.
And we do this rebranding, we do this shifting. It's a whole lot of different things that you were touching on that are baked into sort of capturing a real story and how it's delivered and how it's sort of recorded.
Mm-hmm.
Hey guys, Rob Lee here, chiming in the middle of the podcast, and we'll be right back to that in a moment. But I wanted to remind you that if you're following me on Instagram, and I hope you are, The Truth in This Art, make sure that you explore the links, the link in bio. I know that people always talk about follow me, link in bio, and all of that, but there's some valuable stuff in there, such as a survey for my newsletter. You've probably received the newsletter, and if not, definitely sign up for it. There's some interesting stuff there. We have profiles on certain guests. We have sort of curated episodes, because we're around 800 right now, and it's a lot to go through, and all of them won't be available on every platform all the time. So being able to revisit and go back there to check out those episodes is important. So definitely check out the survey. Let us know what you think of the newsletter and what you would like to have included in there, and continue to make this podcast yours as well as mine's. And back to the podcast, rapid fire. Now I got that out of the way. I'm to step off my soapbox. I got a couple rapid fire questions, because here's the thing. This is how I know a conversation's gone well, when I've added multiple rapid fire questions.
I'm saying, all right.
All right. So, as I tell people all the time, don't overthink these. I said what I said. That's sort of the answers we're looking for here. All right. Here's the first one. I think there's a closeness and a sort of perception on what folks might call you, right? Like the diminutive of your name. So like there are some people that call me Rob. People in a professional setting is like, all right, Robert. No one calls me Bobby. I'm like, yeah, you got to figure that out. What do they call you? Are you Dom? Are you Nick? Are you always Dominic? What is it?
So most people call me Dom. I would say that started when I was playing soccer. It was the first time people started calling me Dom when I was like 12-ish years old, and that kind of always stuck. There was a 10-year period when I was in the company, people called me Dommy.
Okay. All right. I like it. I like it. I like it because I've been studying Japanese for like the last 400 or so days. And I like the Japanese version of my name, Roboto. I was like, yeah, just call me. Throw that out there.
I will say about my name though, and this kind of drives me crazy, is that if you think about the line across America under Tennessee, as soon as that passed that line, everyone calls me Dominique.
Oh, there's no Q.
It's crazy. It's crazy. They will look at my name and say Dominique, and as soon as I come back north, people say it right again. It's the wildest thing.
I went to Morgan State University. I had a teacher, and again, 6'4", tall dude or what have you, and bigger guy. And I remember my teacher would say, so Roberts with an S. And I'm like, yeah, I'm not two people. What? Huh? what are we doing?
What's up?
Okay, here's the next one. Obviously, you were describing, sort of some of the movement getting warmed up and things of that nature. I would imagine it's a very physically taxing sort of pursuit, right? Do you have a favorite activity, physical activity that like keeps you limber? Are you a big stretcher? Are you hitting the gym regularly, with the weights? What does that look like for you?
So this is the funny thing. So I grew up dancing, grew up playing soccer. Outside of like having to do like my quote unquote job stuff, I'd never want to do anything else because I'm in so much pain from doing the thing I'm supposed to be doing. But one of the things I actually loved the most, I did it for a while, was hot yoga because
Okay.
it gets your muscles really warm. And that's someone who's flexible, but I'm like a tighter, flexible person.
Yeah.
It would get my muscles really loose so I could like really, really stretch like deeply in my muscles. I'd be sore as all hell afterwards, but it was always like great to like really like get a little too hot, like really move your stuff because then a couple days later when you're less sore, your body was like more limber, more able to do more stuff. Which for someone who's like just a little bit tighter as a dancer, it was super helpful.
I'm a very tight individual. I've been doing the gym five to 6 days a week for like the last year and change. And definitely it was just powerlifting initially. Now it's just sort of full body, more of a bodybuilding approach to try to sculpt and recomp. And I remember one of the things I was talking to with the trainers, it was just like, just get your hips right. It's just always get your hip right. And he was like, your hips are very stiff. And I run every morning now.
Mm,
My knees are terrible. And he was just like, do a lot of this. He's like, you just got to, get a lot. He's like, you're stiff. He's like, just keep that
yeah,
in mind. He's like, and it's cold. So
right.
keep
Gotta
all
get
of
you.
that in mind. And I was like, all right, cool, cool, cool. So definitely I'm hearing that my memory is working
Yeah.
to make sure I'm not stiff and sore. And just, I see the flexibility, especially in the hips. I definitely have spent a lot more time just, body weight squats and things of that nature, really to get in there deep. And I feel it. I feel the gait improving and all of that good stuff.
Yeah, in dance, we also talk about like the pelvis is the center of the human body.
Yeah.
But like in day-to-day life, when you say to somebody like, "What's the center of your body?" They're gonna say like their chest,
Yeah.
right? How most people feel. But like because the pelvis is sets of hinges,
Yeah.
right? As well, like it's so important that that thing is mobile, and it actually like if you think about working the pelvis and then like moving throughout your body, like okay, make sure my pelvis right, my core is right, and then work on the limbs. You also get like a your body's gonna be able to do stuff for much longer in your life too.
That's a good point. Longevity.
Yep.
So this now we delve into more of the pop culture in these last two questions. This is a good one. I like movies. What is a dance movie in your opinion that gets it right? However you deem that. Like from your perspective, it's like, like my partner, she did dance for a while, and one of her favorite movies is Black Swan, and she's like, "Yo, these toes, right?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" Because I'd never seen it. I was like, "Oh, those toes."
Toes, toes. Yeah. The movie Tap
Okay.
from these early '90s was my literal favorite movie growing up. It's made me want to be a professional tap dancer because you have all these tap legends.
Yeah.
Like in the one scene where they're all like challenging each other, right? And it's like 8 minutes of the best tap dancing you've ever seen in your life by these men who are like in their 60s now. It's like the movie that you're like, this is everything a dance movie needs to be, right? It's the greatest thing. I will say one of the things that makes you laugh though, because I saw this online the other day. Someone was talking about how like in the early 2000s there was a time when like we had a bunch of dance movies coming out. You Got Served, Honey, like all these dance movies coming out, and like they felt so raw at the time. And then you look back,
Gonna take it
and
to
you
the streets. Take
dog.
it to the streets.
The beginning of You Got Served, breathe in, breathe out, and you're like pumping the chest, and you thought that was so raw when you were in seventh grade. Bro, you had the long white t-shirt on too. You had the headband like a Marion. You thought
Too real.
everything. You watch it now and you're like, oh.
Whoa. I mean, what is it? What is it? Step Up? It
Oh
was
yeah.
it was in Baltimore, and
Yep.
we do that scene check. I'm like, that ain't how Hamden is. Mm-mm. It's like, all right, sure.
Oh Lord.
Now, it's one thing I'm going to end up having to watch, and you mentioned Taz. I definitely looked this movie up. It's a Gregory Hines joint from
Yep.
'85,
Yep.
White Nights.
White Knights, one of the best dance scenes ever, dog. Man, him and Mikhail Brezhnikov dancing together. Jeez, it's so good. It's that the scene where he bets him he can't do 11 pirouettes,
Yeah.
rips off them pirouettes 11 in a row. You're like, holy crap.
All right, this is the last one. This is the last one I got for you. You'd mentioned a couple of times. I heard you. When you said it. Favorite Disney show?
Good. Okay. My probably favorite Disney movie, and it's because at the time, it was like, to me, the only like black Disney movie was the Goofy movie.
You get it. You get
Like,
it.
in my head, I was like, these are all black characters. All of them are.
Evan Campbell is.
Yeah, right. Like, I was like, when I was a kid, I was like, oh, this is my favorite movie by far. Look at him,
You know,
eye to eye. That's all I needed. But at the end, I was like, this is MC Hammer. This is everything I want to be. Like, this movie is representation for
You're the
me.
perfect cast.
Yeah, that right there. I was like, they went way too hard on eye to eye. Like, this was an R&B single that should have been out. A bop in the club. That should have
Friggin' Martha Wash pops up. I'm like, yo, this is what we're
been
doing.
right. That's what we're doing right now with Goofy. Yeah, man, that was my movie, man. This was like, if I was a character, I wanted to be Max when I grew up. That has always been my favorite.
The last thing I'll say in that vein, and before I head with this the sort of close out here, there is this running bit I'm trying to get out there in the universe, and I'm going to say it in this podcast. I feel like the majority of like Disney cartoons, their themes in the 90s were blackety black, and then when that dipped, the quality dipped.
Quality dip. You so right. You so right. Ooh, yep.
That's just a playlist. It's like, yo,
Yes,
hit that
like-
Darkwing Duck.
Yeah, look, Darkwing Duck boy. It's like when they had all of us on the intro songs to every show, we was doing all right.
Yes.
They stopped the intros. They left us alone. Now look at you.
Yeah. Done. Useless. No pirouettes.
Right.
So, with that, I want to do two things. I want to close out here. One, I want to thank you for coming on and spending some time with me. We did just over an hour. It's been just great to chat. And two, I want to invite and encourage you to share with the listeners, show the shameless plug portion, details. This will be a November release. So, give folks, who are listening, we got listeners all over the place, some of the details, where the tour is at, social media, website, all of that good stuff. Floor is yours.
Yeah, y'all. So the Remember Balloons is coming across the country to 8 cities. We'll be for everyone for Sheridan, Wyoming, University Park, Illinois. We'll be in Des Moines, Iowa, Knoxville, Tennessee, and some other places. You can find all that stuff out at Remember Balloons Live on Instagram and Facebook. Also, you can follow me, Dominic Moore-Dunson, at DMoreDunn on Instagram, or just Dominic Moore-Dunson on Facebook. And if you want to have a taste of what we got going on in the show, you can actually find the original soundtrack to the show on all music platforms. It's just the Remember Balloons by Theron Brown.
And there you have it, folks. I want to again thank Dominic Moore-Dunson for coming on to the podcast and sharing a bit of his story with us. And for Dominic Moore-Dunson, I am Rob Lee, saying that there's art, culture, and community in and around your neck of the woods. You've just got to look for it.